In just 17 tense minutes inside a packed federal courtroom, Judge Andrew H. Stones mocked Michelle Obama, a 61-year-old black lawyer, cutting her off, laughing at her evidence, and calling her fight for civil rights political theater. But Michelle refused to back down. Instead, with a single folder pulled from her briefcase, she exposed 5 years of hidden racial bias, overturned powerful secrets, and left the judge trembling so badly he vanished from the bench overnight and forced him into sudden exile. How did one woman gather proof powerful enough to topple a federal judge, and are other judges hiding similar secrets? And what secrets did she uncover that were enough to bring a federal judge to his knees? And it all began that morning. Michelle Obama stepped out of the black SUV, the Texas sun glinting off the polished marble of the federal courthouse as cameras clicked like a swarm of mechanical locusts. Reporters surged forward, microphones extended like spears, desperate for a sound bite. Michelle, towering in sleek heels, a crisp navy blue suit hugging her slender frame, paused at the courthouse steps and gave them that familiar wry smile, the one that once disarmed world leaders and won over millions. "I hope they've got strong coffee in there," she quipped, lifting a hand as if raising a mug, because this judge's reputation could keep anyone awake. The press burst into quick, startled laughter, the sound echoing off stone columns. A few camera operators chuckled so hard their shots wobbled. It was vintage Michelle, warm, self-assured, a flicker of humor, even as she strode into a lion's den. But behind her trademark calm, there was steel in her eyes. She knew this day would test everything she'd learned in decades of battling injustice, and she intended to win. As she stepped through the courthouse's heavy glass doors, the laughter outside faded into a hush, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Security guards barely blinked as they checked her credentials, recognizing who she was. Inside, the air felt cooler, tinged with the sterility of polished floors and legal dust. Michelle's heels clicked a sharp, steady rhythm as she approached courtroom 12. The brass letters on the door gleamed under fluorescent lights, and for a moment, she paused, inhaling deeply, as though bracing for impact. She pushed open the doors, and a wave of silence rolled over the packed room. Every seat was filled, reporters perched on the edges of their chairs, civil rights activists clutching notepads, and law clerks scribbling furiously. The gallery buzzed with quiet tension, but the instant Michelle crossed the threshold, the murmurs died like candles, snuffed in a sudden wind. High on the polished mahogany bench sat Judge Andrew H. Stones, draped in black robes that pooled around him like dark ocean currents. His silver hair gleamed under the courtroom lights, combed so precisely it looked sculpted from ice. Deep lines carved his face, each one a silent witness to 20 years of presiding over this very courtroom. But it was his eyes that struck Michelle first. Pale, calculating, as cold as a lawyer's rejection letter, and flecked with a kind of cynical amusement. For a second, those eyes rested on Michelle, glinting like twin shards of steel. He leaned slightly toward his clerk, a lean man with nervous hands and spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and in a voice just above a whisper said, "This should be entertaining." Michelle caught the words, she missed nothing, and a flicker of a smirk danced at the corner of her mouth. She knew that in a room like this, even whispers carried weight. And in that instant, the dynamic was set. A queen stepping onto the chessboard, facing a king, convinced he was untouchable. The bailiff's voice boomed over the hush, calling the court to order, and the room seemed to contract, as if every molecule of air leaned closer, straining to hear what would happen next. Michelle took her place at the plaintiff's table, placing her leather briefcase gently on the polished wood. As she straightened her papers, she felt hundreds of eyes boring into her, some with hope, some with doubt, and some with raw curiosity. She refused to glance at Stones again just yet. Instead, she fixed her gaze forward, jaw set, as if seeing straight through the future to the moment when this entire courtroom would gasp in shock. And somewhere deep inside, she almost smiled, because she knew something that Judge Stones and the entire world didn't know yet. Today, the real entertainment wasn't going to come from her. It was going to come from the truth. The courtroom, barely settled, seemed to tighten around the edges, as Judge Andrew H. Stones leaned forward on his bench, his gavel hand resting lightly on polished wood, the silver of his hair gleaming under the lights like a crown for a king who believed his throne was eternal. Michelle Obama, standing tall at the plaintiff's table, began her opening statement, her voice measured and calm, the cadence of a seasoned attorney who'd argued in countless courts and spoken before millions. Your Honor, the evidence will show a consistent pattern of voter suppression that directly violates the constitutional rights of over 50,000 residents. But Stones sliced through her words like a blade through silk. Mrs. Obama, he said, drawing out the syllables as though savoring them, then paused with mock surprise, a smirk twisting his lips. Sorry, Obama. Let's not turn this court into a political rally, shall we? His tone dripped with condescension, each word calibrated to humiliate, and a ripple of uneasy laughter broke through the room, scattered chuckles from a few defense attorneys, the shifting rustle of journalists, scribbling notes even as their eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Michelle held her ground, though her spine stiffened imperceptibly, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. She forced a polite smile, the same mask she'd worn countless times in rooms where her presence was questioned, her voice dismissed, her purpose twisted into something smaller than it truly was. Inside, however, her blood surged like a river breaking through a dam, every muscle vibrating with silent fury at the sheer disrespect emanating from the bench. The camera flashes caught the glint in her eyes, but the courtroom couldn't see the scenes flickering in her mind. She was back in a cramped county courtroom in Chicago, 25 years younger, wearing an off-the-rack navy suit that never quite fit, defending a young black man accused of stealing a carton of milk. The judge that day, an older man with watery blue eyes, had leaned over the bench and said in front of the jury, "Miss Robinson, perhaps you should leave constitutional arguments to the real lawyers." The sting of that moment had branded itself into her bones, the memory rising now like a ghost summoned by Judge Stones's sarcasm. And then, amidst that mental reel of battles, fought and scars earned, a flash of sweetness pierced the rage, a memory of Mrs. Fannie Lewis, an elderly client from Michelle's earliest days as a public defender. Mrs. Lewis had been accused of trespassing at a grocery store for refusing to leave until they honored a coupon that had expired by 3 days. Every time Mrs. Lewis came to court, she toted along a foil-wrapped sweet potato pie, declaring, "Child, I don't trust any lawyer who ain't got a little sugar on their side." Michelle nearly chuckled even now at how Mrs. Lewis would dramatically unwrap the pie on the courtroom benches and offer slices to bailiffs, clerks, and even prosecutors, insisting that justice always tasted better with cinnamon. That memory lingered, a tiny flame of humor glowing beneath the storm clouds gathering in Michelle's chest. But the courtroom wasn't sharing in any of that warmth. Instead, the laughter at Stones's jibe settled into an uncomfortable silence, leaving Michelle alone at the center of a vast stage, facing a judge whose arrogance radiated like heat from the bench. She inhaled slowly, pulling her fury inward like a spear being sharpened, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer but edged with iron. She would not give him the satisfaction of flinching. She would not retreat, not today. Somewhere deep inside, Michelle knew this was the moment that would either crush her or become the first crack in the mighty walls Judge Andrew H. Stones had built around his throne. And as the bailiff called for the next statement, Michelle allowed herself a single thought. He has no idea what's coming. The courtroom seemed balanced on a knife's edge as Michelle Obama finished laying out her evidence, voice steady, eyes blazing with a quiet fire. She spoke of polling places closed without notice, of black voters turned away under flimsy excuses, of statistical patterns that screamed deliberate suppression. But before she could complete her sentence, Judge Andrew H. Stones leaned back in his high-backed chair, steepling his fingers against his chest, and let out a sound that began as a low rumble and rose into a rolling, derisive laugh that echoed off the paneled walls like a slap. "Cell phone videos belong in Facebook posts, not in real law," he thundered, wiping at imaginary tears in his eyes, as if Michelle's arguments were the punchline of some private joke. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a sudden breeze through dry leaves. Reporters exchanged stunned looks, pens frozen mid-scratch, while a few members of the defense chuckled nervously, unsure whether they were witnessing humor or the beginnings of a legal catastrophe. Michelle's face remained perfectly still, not a muscle twitching, though a muscle feathered faintly at her jawline. The silence hung thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then, in a voice softer than anyone expected, Michelle said, "Your Honor, I'd like to approach the bench." Her tone was polite, almost gentle, as though she were asking permission to pour another cup of tea rather than preparing to hurl a grenade into the proceedings. But Stones, eyes glittering with contempt, sliced the air with a dismissive wave of his hand. "That won't be necessary, Mrs. Obama," he said, his lips curled into a half-smile that seemed both smug and weary. "Let's move on to your next political speech." His words hit the room like a stone dropped into water, sending invisible ripples of tension spreading outward from the bench. Michelle stood motionless for a heartbeat, her expression unreadable, before slowly reaching down beside her chair and unlatching her leather briefcase with a faint metallic snap that somehow sounded louder than the judge's gavel. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward as she slipped a hand inside and withdrew a thick manila folder, its edges dog-eared and bristling with colored tabs and sticky notes like tiny flags marking hidden treasure. She laid it gently on the table, the sound of its weight landing on the polished wood, echoing like the first roll of distant thunder. A chorus of low murmurs rustled through the gallery. One reporter even let out a short, nervous laugh that quickly died when no one joined him. There was an electricity in the room, the almost palpable sense that something seismic was about to happen, and that once it did, nothing would be the same again. Michelle let her fingers rest lightly on the folder as she lifted her gaze to meet Judge Stones's eyes. Her voice, when it came, was silk wrapped around steel. "Well, Your Honor, since you've mocked my evidence, perhaps it's time we talk about yours." For the first time that morning, a flicker of uncertainty passed over Stones's face, as fleeting as a cloud crossing the sun. The audience held its collective breath, caught between the absurdity of the judge's earlier laughter and the dawning realization that the real show was only just beginning. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a law clerk dropped a pencil, the small clatter impossibly loud in the charged silence. Michelle allowed herself a tiny, knowing smile, because she knew that in just a few minutes, this courtroom and Judge Andrew H. Stones would never be the same again. Michelle Obama stood with one hand resting lightly on the thick folder, as if feeling the quiet throb of power pulsing inside it. Her eyes locked on Judge Andrew H. Stones, whose earlier bravado seemed to hover around him like a fading mist, thinning with each tick of the clock. The entire courtroom was frozen, an audience poised on the razor's edge between spectacle and history. Michelle opened the folder and drew out the first document, its crisp paper rustling like dry leaves. "Let's start with Morrison v. Texas," she said, her voice carrying an icy clarity that seemed to slice through the stale courtroom air. She lifted her eyes only briefly to the bench. "In that case, Your Honor, you dismissed clear evidence of voter suppression while, and I quote, joking that civil rights lawyers were just ambulance chasers looking for a new bandwagon." A ripple of uneasy laughter swept the gallery, a few chuckles escaping before people realized how grotesque it sounded in the hush of federal court. Judge Stones shifted in his high-backed chair, his jaw clenching, as though he might grind his molars to dust. But Michelle was already turning pages, relentless as a surgeon peeling back layers of flesh. "Then we have Henderson versus Texas Board of Elections," she continued, plucking out a thicker file marked with yellow tabs like caution flags. "In that case, Your Honor, you not only dismissed the claims, but sanctioned the civil rights lawyers who brought them, accusing them of trying to stir up political chaos." She paused for the barest fraction of a second and let a faint, sardonic smile curve her lips. "And let's not forget your words to the lead counsel that day. Son, go chase ambulances instead." This time, the courtroom actually laughed, a brief eruption of humor in the midst of rising horror, as several journalists glanced at one another with wide eyes, and a couple of law students in the gallery shook their heads in disbelief, as though they couldn't fathom a federal judge uttering such a phrase. But the laughter was a fragile thing, trembling on a ledge, waiting for the next shove into silence. Michelle's smile faded as she gently laid the documents down on the polished table, one by one like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Her voice dropped, gathering weight, drawing the air tight around every ear, straining to listen. Your Honor, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned your sanctions in Henderson. She let the words linger, her eyes boring into Stones's pale face. And they called your conduct? She paused, savoring the moment, each syllable crisp. Inappropriate and potentially biased. A single gasp broke free from somewhere near the reporter's row, sharp as a glass shard. Judge Stones's gavel hand, which had been resting with the calm authority of a man accustomed to unchallenged power, began to tremble visibly, a subtle vibration traveling up his arm to the dark sleeve of his robe. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out, as though the very language he once wielded like a weapon had deserted him. The silence that fell was total, profound, pressing in on the room like the depths of the ocean. Reporters, who had been typing furiously, now sat frozen, fingers poised above keys, waiting to capture the next word that might shatter the career of one of America's most imperious judges. Michelle held the courtroom in the palm of her hand, standing in perfect stillness, the quiet so deep it seemed to roar in everyone's ears. She knew there was still more to come, and that the real shock was only just beginning. Time in the courtroom seemed to have grown thick, moving with a slow, syrupy weight as Michelle Obama stood before the bench, a slender figure with a presence that now felt as towering as any marble pillar lining the courthouse walls. The air buzzed with whispers and the subtle rustle of paper, 1,000 tiny noises, somehow amplifying the silence that hung between her and Judge Andrew H. Stones, like a taut wire waiting to snap. She stood motionless for a breathless moment, her fingers gently brushing the folder resting on the polished wood, as if she were absorbing its power into her veins. Then she reached inside and withdrew a document bearing the seal of the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, her movements deliberate, almost reverent, as though handling a sacred text. Lifting the paper high enough for the courtroom to see, she drew in a measured breath that seemed to pull the entire room toward her, as though gravity itself had shifted. Her eyes, dark and gleaming, locked onto Stones, with a gaze so unyielding it seemed to bore straight into the marrow of his bones. And then, Your Honor, Michelle began, her voice low but carrying the sharpness of a scalpel. We come to Davis v. Texas Attorney General. A tremor of curiosity ran through the gallery like an electric current, shoulders stiffening, heads tilting forward, pens frozen above notepads. The defense attorneys, who only minutes ago had been grinning with smug assurance, now sat stiff-backed, their jaws clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Michelle glanced down at the paper, and when she read, each word fell with the weight of a hammer. During those proceedings, Your Honor, you said, and I quote, "These people need to stop complaining about every little rule and learn to follow the law like everyone else." The phrase, "these people," detonated in the silent room like a stick of dynamite, its shockwave rippling out in an expanding ring of gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and startled exclamations. An older woman near the front row sucked in air so sharply she choked on it, coughing into her gloved hands. A man in a crisp gray suit slammed his palm against the armrest, muttering a stunned, "Jesus Christ." Journalists stared wide-eyed at one another, their fingers suddenly flying over keyboards in a frantic scramble to capture every syllable. It was as though the oxygen had been sucked from the room, leaving a vacuum into which every spectator leaned, straining for the next devastating revelation. Somewhere at the back, a young woman whispered, almost to herself, "Did he really say that?" Her voice trembled like the echo of a distant alarm bell. Michelle lowered the paper slowly, her eyes never leaving Stones's face, which had taken on the pallor of an overcast sky. His once commanding posture was crumbling visibly, his body hunching inward as though trying to shield itself from the words hammering down upon him like hail. His lips opened and closed, working silently, yet no sound emerged, as though language itself had abandoned him in his hour of reckoning. The mighty Gavel King, who had once ruled his courtroom with unchallenged authority, now looked very much like an old man caught in a tide too powerful to escape. Michelle let the silence stretch, holding the moment in the palm of her hand, letting the full weight of Stones's words sink into every corner of the courtroom like ink seeping into paper. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet force that seemed to vibrate the very floor. "Your Honor," she said, her tone smooth and precise, "the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned your decision in Davis, and they described your conduct as—" She paused, savoring the suspense, letting the tension coil tighter and tighter until the room felt ready to burst. "Inappropriate and potentially biased." A wave of shocked murmurs broke over the gallery like surf crashing onto rocks. Reporters exchanged glances filled with both disbelief and a predatory gleam, as though scenting a story destined for front-page headlines. One young clerk in a navy suit leaned forward so abruptly his chair squealed on the polished marble floor. Another older lawyer dropped his glasses onto the table, letting them clatter and spin in the heavy silence. Judge Stones's gavel hand, previously a symbol of unshakable power, now trembled so violently it caused the dark sleeve of his robe to flutter like a black flag in a storm. His eyes, wide and bloodshot, flicked from Michelle to the growing pile of documents stacked like silent witnesses to his unraveling. He swallowed hard, the sound almost grotesquely loud in the hush, as if trying to force back the rising tide of panic clawing up his throat. Michelle gently set the damning document on the table, aligning it perfectly with the other papers in the folder, as if constructing a fortress of truth. She drew in a breath and raised her chin, projecting an aura so composed and commanding that for a moment she seemed to expand beyond her physical frame, radiating the moral certainty of someone who knew she was about to tip the scales of justice forever. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing like a bell tolling for a fallen king, "I move that this court recuse itself for documented bias." Her words sliced through the courtroom, crisp and final as a verdict. The reaction was instantaneous, as though she'd fired a gun into the ceiling. Gasps burst from every corner of the room, a chorus of astonishment and adrenaline. Reporters lunged forward, hands raised like supplicants, already shouting questions over one another. A law clerk covered his mouth in shock, eyes so wide they seemed ready to spill tears. Several people in the gallery twisted in their seats, craning to see Judge Stones's face, desperate to witness the precise moment a titan fell. Stones remained frozen, a pale husk of a man, his jaw working soundlessly, eyes darting around the room as though seeking escape through invisible doors. Finally, his voice scraped out, a thin, broken whisper that carried none of its former authority. "Court is in recess." The gavel fell once, twice, each strike softer than the last, sounding less like a hammer of law and more like the final nails in a coffin. Slowly, Stones rose from his seat, his black robe billowing around him like storm clouds dissipating in the sun, and he staggered toward the private chambers behind the bench without looking back. The gallery erupted into a chaotic blend of gasps, urgent whispers, and the furious clatter of fingers on keyboards as journalists raced to immortalize what they'd just witnessed. Michelle remained standing, motionless, the chaos swirling around her as though she were the calm eye at the center of a hurricane. She lowered her hands to rest gently on the folder that had roared louder than any gavel and lifted her gaze to the gallery, her eyes shining with the quiet certainty of a woman who had just reminded the world that no one, not even a federal judge, is above the truth. And as the great wooden doors swung shut behind the retreating figure of Judge Stones, the courtroom seemed to exhale as one, every soul inside fully aware that they had witnessed the day justice was not just spoken, but won. The morning after the courtroom erupted with revelation felt almost surreal, as though the building itself hadn't quite recovered from the earthquake of truth Michelle Obama had unleashed. Pale dawn light slanted through the courthouse's massive arched windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the beams, as if time were moving slower out of respect for what had taken place inside these walls. Security guards at the entrance stood a little straighter, casting sidelong glances at the reporters gathering on the courthouse steps, their voices pitched with anticipation rather than the hollow routine that usually accompanied these proceedings. It was as if everyone sensed that when they stepped through those doors today, they weren't just observers. They were witnesses to the closing scene of a drama that would be taught in law schools for generations. Inside courtroom 12, the gallery filled quickly, but the atmosphere was different. Yesterday, the air had been taut with skepticism and a kind of uneasy expectation that Judge Stones would inevitably crush whatever argument dared challenge his authority. Today, the energy was breathless, reverent, almost hushed in the way people behave when they know they are on the verge of watching something historic conclude. A reporter from the Washington Post flipped through her notes for the 100th time, checking that every quote had been transcribed correctly. A young clerk in the front row balanced a legal pad on his knee, scribbling the heading, "Implications for Judicial Ethics Reform," in careful block letters. And at the defense table, the attorneys who had once worn smug half-smiles now looked more like schoolboys awaiting the principal's wrath. It did not go unnoticed that Judge Stones's high-backed chair remained empty, the heavy leather looking somehow deflated without the presence of its former occupant. For several long minutes, the room sat in a kind of suspended animation, each second stretching longer than the last, as people craned their necks toward the door that led to the judge's chambers. At last, the door opened, but not to admit the man everyone had expected to see. Instead, Stones's clerk emerged, moving slowly, his pale hands trembling slightly as he clutched a folded piece of white paper. His glasses slipped low on his nose as he cleared his throat, the sound brittle and thin as dry twigs snapping underfoot. He raised his eyes to the gallery, blinking rapidly, and began to read in a voice that cracked halfway through the first sentence. Due to health concerns, Judge Andrew H. Stones is stepping down indefinitely from all judicial duties, effective immediately. The final words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, drifting through the courtroom as gasps, low whistles, and a scatter of disbelieving laughter broke free from the gallery. Michelle sat at the plaintiff's table, her back straight, her hands resting lightly atop the same thick folder that had toppled a career. Her expression was inscrutable, but her eyes glimmered with something deeper than satisfaction, a recognition that this moment was not about vengeance, but about something far more consequential: accountability. She tilted her head fractionally, a single elegant eyebrow arched, and with a voice pitched perfectly to carry across the hushed room, she remarked, "Funny how justice can make you sick." For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence. Then laughter burst out in warm, spontaneous waves, rolling over the tension that had coiled around them for days. Even the bailiff, a man who had maintained the blank detachment of a statue through the entire trial, let the corners of his mouth flicker upward before quickly resuming his professional composure. Outside, the news spread faster than wildfire. By the time Michelle stepped through the courthouse doors into the golden light of mid-morning, journalists were already delivering live updates, voices breathless as they recounted the sequence of events that had led to one of the most public judicial resignations in recent memory. Microphones thrust forward in a forest of black foam, cameras panned in tight, and a chorus of questions rose in overlapping waves. "Mrs. Obama, did you expect Judge Stones to step down? Do you think this will set a precedent? What message do you have for other attorneys?" Michelle raised a hand in a quiet gesture for patience, her expression calm but resolute. "This was never about any one person," she said, her voice steady as the lenses and microphones zeroed in. "It was about the principle that no robe, no gavel, no bench is above the truth." Within weeks, the reverberations of her stand began to reshape the legal landscape. Law professors at Harvard, Yale, and Howard gathered to draft new modules for their ethics courses, entire lectures built around what students quickly dubbed the Obama Protocol. In classrooms filled with ambitious young attorneys, instructors described how Michelle had constructed her case methodically, piece by piece, until no pretense of impartiality could stand against it. Over coffee in bustling student lounges, law clerks and interns began swapping stories about judges who had skated by on unchecked bias for too long, each wondering if they might someday have the courage to expose it. One afternoon in a small courtroom in New Orleans, A fresh-faced public defender, no older than 27, stepped up to the lectern with a folder so thick it looked like it had swallowed half the archives. As he adjusted his tie with a shaky hand, his colleague leaned over and whispered with a grin, "Trying to outdo Michelle Obama." The young lawyer smiled nervously, his voice cracking with the eagerness of someone still getting used to the power of his own convictions. "I'm getting me a folder just like Michelle's," he said, and the two of them laughed, their voices warm and buoyant against the somber wood-paneled walls. But beneath the humor and the relief lay the deeper, unspoken truth that had settled like a new foundation beneath the legal profession. Something seismic had shifted. For years to come, attorneys and judges alike would feel the ripple effect of that day. The knowledge that no matter how high a bench someone sat upon, no matter how confidently they wielded the gavel, there would always be someone brave enough and prepared enough to stand, look them in the eye, and say, "No more." As Michelle walked down the courthouse steps, the wind caught the edge of her blazer, lifting it like a banner behind her. The cameras followed her every stride, but she didn't look back, her gaze fixed firmly ahead. She knew the headlines would call it the downfall of a judge, but in her heart, she understood it was something more important, the quiet, unstoppable victory of the truth. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm, amber glow over the courthouse steps as the last of the news vans pulled away, their antennae retracting like the limbs of exhausted creatures. The marble columns glistened under the fading light, silent witnesses to the storm that had passed through their halls and left history etched into their very stones. Inside, the empty courtroom echoed faintly with the memory of gavel strikes, gasps, and the steady cadence of a woman's voice speaking truth to power. But in the corridor outside, amid the lingering scent of old wood polish and sun-warmed marble, Michelle Obama stood alone, the thick manila folder clutched in one hand like a relic of war. She faced the camera now, her figure bathed in the soft glow of sunset, her features calm, but eyes blazing with a depth that seemed to reach through the screen itself. For a moment, she said nothing, letting the quiet fill the space, drawing her audience closer with the gravity of silence. Then she tilted her chin ever so slightly and spoke, her voice low but carrying an unshakable force. "Have you ever been laughed at for telling the truth?" she asked, each word delivered with surgical precision, as if aimed at the very heart of anyone listening. Her gaze didn't waver, didn't soften. "And if so, what would you do if the whole world was watching?" A breeze rustled through the hallway, lifting a few stray papers that skittered across the polished floor, as though even the air itself was leaning in to hear her next words. Michelle held the silence for one heartbeat more, her eyes never blinking, then let a faint, almost imperceptible smile curve the edges of her lips. "Justice isn't polite," she said finally, her voice quiet but ringing with finality. "But it is unstoppable." The words hung there, shimmering in the air, echoing through the empty corridors like the soft toll of a bell. And as the camera slowly pulled back, framing her in the grand architecture of the courthouse, it became clear that this was not just the end of one courtroom drama, it was the spark of a larger movement. A reminder to anyone watching that sometimes all it takes is one voice, armed with truth, to bring a giant crashing down. The characters Michelle Obama and Judge Andrew H. Stones in this story are fictional and do not represent real people in real life. This story is a work of creative storytelling, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel so I can continue bringing you more powerful, emotional tales about justice, truth, and courage. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.